Is this, we're good, okay. Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the 11th Annual San Antonio Book Festival. My name is Gilbert Garcia. I'm the Metro columnist for the San Antonio Express News, and I'm really excited to be here and to have you here with our author, Reza Aslan. Before we get started, I want to mention a couple of things. We'll be live streaming this session to the SABF YouTube channel. And book sales and signings will take place 15 minutes after the session ends at the Nowhere Bookshop tent outside in the festival marketplace. I also want to leave about 10 minutes at the end of the session for any questions that you might have. And there's a microphone that's going to be going around. So just look for that, and we'll try to take as many questions as we can. Our author, Reza Aslan, is a leading expert in world religions. He's also a renowned writer, professor, Emmy and Peabody nominated producer, and co-host with Rainn Wilson of the wonderfully titled podcast Metaphysical Milkshake. He's a recipient of the prestigious James Joyce Award, and the author of 3 international best-selling books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. His latest book, An American Martyr in Persia, The Epic Life and Tragic Death of Howard Baskerville, tells the story of a young American Christian missionary who went to Persia, which we now know as Iran, in 1907, and he was killed a year and a half later, fighting in the cause of a constitutional revolution against an oppressive Shah. Reza, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gil. Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here in San Antonio.
As I mentioned, Howard Baskerville went to Iran in 1907. He was 22 years old at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about his life up to that point and how he ended up in Iran?
Well, Howard Baskerville was the son and grandson of Presbyterian preachers. So he came from a long line of men of the cloth. And he had gone to Princeton University, which back then basically was just a factory to kind of spit out Presbyterian ministers, just like his father did, with the express purpose of getting a degree in Christian ministry and then going back to, his family had moved around a lot, but at that point, even though he was born in Nebraska, they were living in South Dakota. And the plan was to graduate with a degree in Christian ministry, go back to South Dakota, become a country preacher, like his father and his grandfather. But he had this kind of auspicious experience in Princeton. He had arrived at the university a year after Princeton had made one of its most popular and problematic professors, Woodrow Wilson, the new president of the university. And look, there's a lot that we can say about Woodrow Wilson. Okay, on the one hand, he defeated fascism, not bad. He created the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. He has an incredible legacy with that regard. On the other hand, he was an unapologetic racist, and what I mean by that is that he was an ardent supporter of the Confederacy long after the Civil War was over. What I mean by that is when he entered Princeton as the president, he refused to follow in the footsteps of the other Ivy League schools and allow black students in the university. And when asked why, he said, quote, "because it would be embarrassing for them and for us." What I mean by that is that when he became president of the United States, he fired the entire federal black workforce, except one person. One black man was allowed to stay in his job because no one else could do that particular job. So, complicated. But he did do something extraordinary, which is he essentially gave birth to our modern university system. And one of the things that he created was what we now refer to as electives. And so Howard Baskerville was in this situation in which he had no choice during his junior year but to take courses that weren't in Christian ministry. And the courses that he chose to take were 2 courses with Woodrow Wilson himself, a course in international governance and then a course in jurisprudence. And what he heard in those classrooms was this kind of Wilsonian idea that democracy is a gift from God to all humans, that it is God's will for all peoples everywhere to be free and to be able to determine their own course of life, and that that is where the world was headed, and that it was the responsibility of not just America, but Americans to make that a reality. This, of course, would become the foundation of his eventual presidency. But, you know, if you can imagine like a 20-year-old kid, you know, Christian kid of privilege, already, you know, brimming with the Spirit of the Lord, this was a very compelling message for Baskerville, and it completely changed the trajectory of his life. And so when he graduated, to the consternation of his parents and his community, rather than go back to South Dakota, he decided that he wanted to go and see the world. Back then, go and see the world means become a missionary. That's what, there's no other way that you go and like experience the world. So he applied to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions to become a missionary. As I write in the book, he desperately wanted to go to China or Japan. He'd read all these like incredible missionary reports.
Didn't want to go to Iran.
Iran was the last place that he wanted to go. It was back then it was still called Persia, but he absolutely did not want to go to Persia. He had been, you know, combing through these reports from ministers and missionaries in Persia, calling it the worst place. You know, that the solid wall of Mohammedanism is what they would refer to it, is unbroken and cannot be broken. We cannot, you know, get a foothold in this place. One missionary report warned that all the sins in the Decalogue are ever present in Persia, and add to that the gravest sin of Sodom. So, you know, this 22-year-old kid is reading this and he's like, anywhere but Persia. Anywhere but Persia. And of course,
yeah,
he gets assigned Persia.
You were talking about Woodrow Wilson's problematic history, and there's a great quote in your book, and I think this came from the actor-singer Paul Robeson, where he said, with regard to Woodrow Wilson, he wants democracy for the world, but Jim Crow for the United States, right? Something like that, which I think is... Yeah.
It's weird. I mean, look, we could spend this whole hour talking about Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, I don't want to...
But, you know, it's hard to reconcile the passion and I think earnestness with which he would talk about and preach about. Also a son of Presbyterian preachers who went to Princeton to become a Presbyterian preacher but ended up becoming a politician instead. He would speak with such conviction about freedom and democracy and you know the role of the individual as being, you know, without bondage. And then in the same breath, he premiered Birth of a Nation at the White House. You know, I don't know what to say.
We're going to talk in a minute about Baskerville and the role he played in the revolution in Iran. But I wanted to ask you about your early experience, because you spent your first 7 years in Iran. Your family moved to the United States after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And one of the things that struck me about the book was this was someone from the United States who's pretty much unknown to most people in this country, but was celebrated in Iran. Yeah. How much in those early years of your life when you were living there did you hear about him? Was his a name that popped up?
Yeah, I mean, look, when I was a kid in Iran, his name was everywhere. You know, there were schools named after Howard Baskerville, streets named after Howard Baskerville. One of the biggest schools in Tehran had its auditorium named the Baskerville Auditorium. his tomb is still in the city of Tabriz, this beautiful marble tomb that became a kind of pilgrimage site. Next to it is a museum dedicated to that revolution that he died in. But in that museum, there's an entire wing that's kind of a Baskerville wing. It's got a beautiful painting of him and a bronze bust of him and the weapon that he used in the revolution. He was unquestionably considered a hero and a martyr, which in Iran means something profound, and it's rare to give that identity to a non-Muslim, but to give it to this 22-year-old white Christian missionary from Nebraska, tells you the esteem with which Iranians held this young man. And so when I came to the US when I was 7 years old, it was a kind of a surprise to me that this person that was a hero in my home country was utterly unknown. I just assumed that he would be a hero here. And no one had ever heard of this kid. No one, it's not like, they knew who he was, but he was no longer celebrated. Every time I said Baskerville, people would be like, you mean like the Hound of Baskerville? Are you no?
In a little bit, we'll talk about the complicated, the United States government's complicated relationship with him and his legacy. But I wanted to talk about the fact that the Persia, or the Iran that he entered in 1907, this was a country that had experienced an uprising. This is the first democratic revolution in the Middle East.
This was the first democratic revolution in the Middle East. Yeah,
and they basically compelled the Shah to put in place a constitutional system. But 3 days after he signed, this is amazing to me, 3 days after he signed the Constitution into law, he dies.
Wouldn't you know it?
His son replaces him, and he ultimately throws out the Constitution. He dissolves the parliament. And so we see a rebellion that forms against him, and which Howard Baskerville is ultimately drawn into. But he was at a school where he's supposed to be converting, as you said, converting Muslims to Christianity. He's not supposed to be involved in politics.
No.
How aware was he in those early months of what was going on around him?
Yeah. It's a big no-no for missionaries to get involved in politics, even today. So in 1905, a group of young, zealous, well-educated Iranians, men and women, began pouring out onto the streets of Tehran, demanding a constitution and a parliament. A constitution that would lay out all the rights and privileges of the citizens, and then a parliament which would not only have the right to create laws, but more importantly, would be able to act as a check on the, just absolute authority of the Shah. And it took about a year and a half or so, and there was a lot of, bloodshed and riots and strikes and ups and downs, but ultimately they won. And the Shah was compelled to not just sign a constitution, very progressive document that laid out freedom of speech, freedom of religion, gave laid out the rights and privileges of all the citizens of the country, but also allowed for the election of a legislature. And then, as you say, then 3 days later he died, and then his son, who was this 35-year-old kid, I guess I'm older now, I can call him a kid, 35-year-old, named Muhammad Ali, not that Muhammad Ali, but you'll remember his name, came into power. And it's funny, it was really fun to write about this guy because he's almost a comic book villain. It's almost, if it was fiction, you'd be like, all right, take it easy. He, grew up being told that Persia was his by right, that God had placed him on the throne, that he could do whatever he wants with the country, and that only God could remove him from his throne. And he was incensed with his father for having deigned to put any kind of curbs and limitations on his power. And he had a powerful ally, which was the Russian Empire, which had just barely survived its own revolution and wanted to make sure that there would be nothing even approaching democracy on its southern border. And so with the tacit encouragement of his Russian advisors, he launches a war against the constitutionalists. You say that, yeah, he shut down the parliament. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Actually, what he did was he rolled all of his Russian-made cannons to the parliament building and destroyed it while parliament was in session with all the parliamentarians inside. That was his way of saying, okay, that's it, it's over. Yeah. And he, with his Russian-trained forces, went city by city, town by town, province by province, recapturing the entirety of the country back to the crown. Every city except one city. This one city at the very, very northwest of Iran called Tabriz. And that is the city that Howard Baskerville just happened to be assigned to teach and preach the gospel. He worked as a teacher. He was teaching English and history. At first, he gets a second class later on during his second year in international law. And, you know, his job is to convert the population. It's a missionary school, sure, but it's mostly Muslim kids.
And he wasn't very successful at converting.
No, he was terrible at it. He was absolutely terrible at it. And it's not like he didn't try. He really did. Yeah. You know, there's all kinds of testimony from his fellow teachers and the headmaster about, you know, how open and willing he was to share his faith. But the truth of the matter is that the missionaries weren't all that successful really anywhere in Persia, but especially in Tabriz. Tabriz is this kind of historic the crossroads, right? So it's like it borders Turkey on one side, it borders Russia on the other side. It's always been a kind of a multicultural, multi-religious, very small but cosmopolitan city. And when you're in a city like that, on the one hand, it's a pretty good place to to establish a mission, because you'll be welcomed. You know, it's not like they're not used to foreigners and missionaries. On the other hand, it's very difficult to make an argument that everyone here is doing it wrong and you should be doing it like this instead. It wasn't a very powerful argument, but the missionaries did create amazing hospitals, incredible schools. You know, the services that they provided had absolutely endeared them to the population. So there was a lot of love for these missionaries, just not a lot of agreement with the whole, you know, give your life to Jesus part.
As this revolutionary movement is happening in Tabriz, this was such a complicated situation for Baskerville, because it's not only that the school doesn't want him or any of the other teachers affiliated with this political movement, but also he's fallen in love with the daughter of the headmaster of the school, and so he probably doesn't want to agitate the headmaster, I would think. When did he reach the point where he just thought, I can't ignore what's happening around me, and I have to get involved?
Yeah, well, so one thing that's really fun about his story is that, remember, he went kicking and screaming to Persia because he had heard just the worst things, and almost immediately he realizes that all of that was a lie, that he immediately falls in love with the people, the culture. He absolutely adores his students. He's instantly the most popular teacher at the school. He's also the youngest by a decade, so that helps. And just, you know, completely immerses himself, goes crazy for Persian cuisine. I mean, how can you not? It's obvious. I mean, the guy's like, from Nebraska. He's like been eating boiled potatoes all his life, and then suddenly, he's introduced to Persian cuisine. He's having dinners at his students' houses. He's, just fully integrated. And then on the other hand, on the other part of this is a kid who just spent an entire year being told by Woodrow Wilson that it's God's will that soon every country in the world will be free. And then he shows up in the middle of a revolution, the purpose of which is to free the country from the autocrat and to turn it into a democracy. So he can't even believe it. For him, it's like he's walked into a history book. But as you say, he is constantly being told by the school that's employing him, by the church that sent him there, by the US government that controls him, that none of this is your business. You are here to preach the gospel. You can have nothing to do with what's going on. And, for the most part, he does. He puts his head down and preaches, teaches, does his work that's expected of him. But as this revolution gets further and further and further, and eventually, as I was telling you, the Shah's troops are coming closer and closer and closer, they finally arrive in Tabriz. And for months, there is this war back and forth between Tabriz, where all the constitutionists, all the revolutionaries have kind of, gathered as their last stand. And as this kind of conflict now goes right out into the open, it's becoming harder and harder and harder for him to maintain his commitment to his ministry and his teaching. He's walking past corpses on his way to school. His students are disappearing and not coming back. It's really difficult for him to ignore this revolution after a while.
Ultimately, he gave up his job to join the revolutionary cause, and his students followed him. There was this blockade of Tabriz, and as you said, people are starving, and he wanted to break this blockade. The scene that you describe, it really sounds like a movie scene where he's basically giving this rousing speech,
It's very cinematic
and the
story,
students
yeah.
the students are just
It's insane.
they're with you.
I couldn't have made
like
that
a football
scene
coach
up.
or something,
I couldn't
yeah.
have made it up. So ultimately, what finally tilts the balance for Baskerville is the Shah's troops arrive sometime around the end of 1908, the beginning of 1909. And after a couple of months of mortars and skirmishes and fighting, it becomes very clear that they're not going to take Tabriz. They just can't defeat this town. And so they change tactics, and instead they create a blockade around the town. They cut off all food, all water, all supplies, and they just sit back and allow the townsfolk to starve to death, which they do. It's a horrific humanitarian crisis. 10,000 men, women, and children die of starvation. And at that point, that's it for Baskerville. He just can't do this anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore. And so, as Gil was saying, there's this moment where he stands before his classroom and he says, I can no longer ignore the suffering of these people that I have come to serve. And the only way that I know how to fulfill my duty as an American, as a Christian, as a missionary, is to quit my job as a teacher, to abandon my missionary post, and to go and defend this city. I don't know what else to do. So I'm giving up teaching, and I'm going to go get a gun, and I'm going to join the revolution. And in this, absolutely cinematic moment, built for Hollywood, his students stand up and follow him. And if you can imagine, it's bad enough for the school that one of their teachers went and joined the revolution, but he took the students with him. This is a pretty expensive upper middle class school, I mean, it's taught in English. That alone should tell you the kind of students who are there. And so, you know, having to explain to their parents, their teacher led them off to war, was horrible, as you can imagine. So they try everything to deter Baskerville. And there's a sort of really wonderful moment in which the American consul general goes to him on the battlefield and says to him, you can't do this. You're not an American. This is not your country. These are not your people. This is not your war. And Baskerville responds with the line that has made him famous for 100 years in Iran. He says, the only difference between me and these people is the place of my birth, and that is not a big difference. And he hands his passport over to the American consul general, and in that moment gives up his American citizenship in order to defend this city and the democracy that they had built from the Shah's troops.
And he ultimately ends up taking a bullet to the heart in this effort to try to break the blockade.
April 20th, which is just a few days away.
Yeah.
On April 20th, the decision had been made that there's just no more food. There's nothing. Either we all die of starvation or we die trying to break the siege. So early morning on the morning of April 20th, they put together this plan to attack the blockade from a number of different paths. And the person who's going to take the northwest pass is Howard Baskerville and his students. Mm-hmm. So it's him and about a dozen teenagers. I'm sure they've never shot a gun before. Yeah. It was really a foolish, and one could say maybe even suicidal attempt. But what else were they going to do at that point? As you say, the battle did not last very long. He takes a bullet to the heart.
And a lot of things ensue, but basically because of the backlash to what happened, there's a ceasefire that I think the Shah calls, and then the constitutionalists are able to
it's this kind of amazing thing. The British and the Russians were already queasy about what was happening in Tabriz. Yes, of course, they wanted the Shah to defeat the revolution, democracy. It's annoying when you're an empire, but tens of thousands of people starving to death. That's not good press. So they were already pressuring the Shah to declare a ceasefire, and the Shah wouldn't do it. But the death of an American was the last straw. I mean, tens of thousands of Iranians could die, and that's embarrassing and uncomfortable. But an American was killed. That can't happen. And so the Shah was forced to call a ceasefire, but the revolutionaries very cleverly used the ceasefire to break the siege and march onto Tehran, pull the Shah from his throne, re-establish the constitution, rebuild the parliament, and have new elections. And indeed, the very first act of the new parliament was to declare Howard Baskerville a martyr and hero in the cause of Iranian democracy.
Reza, as anyone who's read your book, Zealot, knows, you have a strong interest in the concept of martyrdom, the idea that someone not only talks about their faith, but puts their faith to action. And in the case of Baskerville, someone who's willing to really sacrifice his life for those principles. Can you talk a little bit about what you see, the power of martyrdom, what it really represents to you?
No, thank you for that. And it is true that I've always been really drawn to figures who, when confronted with injustice, activate their faith in order to do something about it. Those are the people that I've always been drawn to and fascinated by. And Baskerville is certainly one of those people, which is why I've always been drawn to him. But I think it's funny because you know, as we said earlier, he was not that successful as a missionary. You know, the preaching of the gospel wasn't something that I think a lot of Iranians were interested in, because in Iran, as in so much of the world, religion isn't like a personal, individual, confessional experience. Religion is identity. It's who you are. You don't just like in America, you know, you like change your religions like you're changing your outfits. You know, like that's not a thing in the rest of the world. And in any case, the idea of like preaching a religion is not effective because, again, for most of the world, but certainly in Iran, religion is about the things that you do, not the things that you believe. And so there's this really beautiful letter that the wife of the headmaster of the school writes to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, which had disavowed Baskerville. In fact, not only disavowed Baskerville in a very humorous moment when the State Department writes these frantic letters to the Presbyterian Church saying, one of your missionaries has joined the revolution. We tried to stop him. He handed over his passport. And so he's your problem. Go and get him. Go and get your boy. They write this very curt memo back, which says, Howard Baskerville's technically not one of our missionaries. He's actually a teacher at a missionary school, so he's not our problem. And there's this kind of really funny back and forth memos in the State Department that I quote, where the Secretary of State is like, what the hell does that even mean? Like, what? Not a missionary, but a teacher at a missionary school? What is the difference? But so the headmaster's wife, Annie, writes this beautiful letter to the Presbyterian Board, basically trying to explain Baskerville's actions. And what she wants to emphasize is that you may have heard that he had like abandoned his faith in order to join this revolution. But he didn't abandon his faith. He abandoned his mission. This was his faith. He was doing, he had decided that it was time to stop talking about Jesus and just go do what Jesus would do. And she says in that letter, and this kind of beautiful ending to it, that action has done more to spread the gospel than the last 50 years of us being here preaching. So there is something really powerful about that idea, right, of this kid who was, in his mind, fulfilling his missionary duties by quitting his missionary duties and picking up a gun and defending these people that he had come to serve.
I think it's probably a good time to take some questions. I think there's a microphone that's going to be passed around. So, yes, ma'am. You have a question? We'll get a microphone to you. She's right over here. Thank you.
I bought American Martyr because I have your other books. But my question is there another one coming out? I'm looking forward to this one and also to the next one.
You know, it's funny because like usually, you know, I always say like writing a book and releasing it, it's almost like having a baby. So I hear. And you know, right now I'm just kind of enjoying the baby. But my next book is actually going to be a work of fiction.
Okay. I know we got a couple of other questions here.
So can you know, as I was reading your book, which was absolutely wonderful, I could not help but see the similarities or challenges to Zealot, which you had Jesus, who had not a lot of, you had to do a great deal of extrapolation and imagination as to who Jesus was, and you had to put together a lot of sources to do that. And then here you had Howard, who was only 22 and hadn't kept any kind of real record of his life, so you didn't go to some library that had all of Howard's, fabulous thoughts for generations that neither existed. So you had to do a great deal of imagination. Can you just talk about the craft of doing that?
I really appreciate you pointing that out. In fact, writing this book really felt a lot like writing Zealot, in the sense that at the heart of both of those books is this historical individual that we know almost nothing about. We know almost nothing about the historical Jesus, and we know very little about Howard Baskerville. In fact, most of the things that we know about him, like with Jesus, were written about him after he died. But also in both cases, while we know very little about the individual, we know everything about the world in which he lived. We know everything about first century Palestine. I mean, this is a very well-researched period in history. And we know a lot about the so-called constitutional revolution. As I say, it was the first democratic revolution in the entire Middle East. It was, at least for a little while, enormously successful. Iran became the very first constitutional monarchy in all of Asia. So, as you can imagine, this was a period of time that has a lot of research in it. So the challenge in both situations was to take an individual that we know very little about and to put him in a time and place that we know a lot about, make that time and place come alive, and then his actions, the few things that we do know about him, start to make sense. We start to recognize why he would have done something. We start to recognize who he was interacting with and how that would have affected, his decisions and the things that he did, the things that he said. So in many ways, honestly, the experience of writing this book and the experience of writing Zealot, it really felt the same as I was writing them.
Hi, Reza. So as you know, Iranians are still fighting for democracy and freedom in Iran, and many would probably argue that the thousands of Iranians that are out in the streets are martyrs. I'd love to know your take on the recent activities in Iran and why you think Iranians haven't been able to achieve that freedom and democracy that we've been fighting for hundreds of years. Thank you.
Yeah, Iran is, as many of you probably know, is undergoing what I have gone on record and talked about as its fourth revolution. Iran has had 3 previous revolutions in the past century. There was the 1905 revolution, the constitutional revolution, which created a constitutional monarchy, which post the First World War collapsed and then was ultimately overrun by a military coup at the hands of a man who would become Reza Shah, the next king of Iran. There was a revolution against Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Shah, in 1953. It's often referred to as the nationalist revolution. The Shah was thrown out of the country, and the country was turned into a parliamentary democracy. If you're familiar with your American history, you know that the CIA put an end to that very quickly. Forced the prime minister out of his position and brought the Shah, literally flew the Shah back and put him back on the throne. And then, of course, there was the 1979 revolution, which unfortunately is often mislabeled as the Islamic Revolution. It was not an Islamic revolution. It was a revolution that was participated by Muslims and Jews and Christians and Marxists and communists and leftists and clerics. It was an anti-imperial revolution, which unfortunately in the post-revolutionary chaos was hijacked by Khomeini and the clerical regime, and the hope for a post-revolutionary democracy was transformed into just another form of autocracy, a religious one instead of a secular one. And so the question remains, how could a country have 4 revolutions, all 4 of them with the singular purpose of eking out the most minimum amount of freedom, you know, like just the ability to think and say what you want. That's not asking a lot, you know, just the sort of basic human right of having a say in the decisions that rule your life. 115 years, Iranians have been dying for that right. And for 115 years, it has been taken from them, either by internal fighting or by outside forces or now by the religious establishment. I'm going to be honest with you, it's hard not to be depressed when you think about it. It's really hard. It's really hard to maintain any kind of optimism. And there are days when I just feel like burying my head and just, you know, forgetting about all of it. But I will say, I really and truly believe that what is happening in Iran right now is unprecedented. And I think partly that has to do with the fact that it is a female-led movement. And women in Iran, despite the fact that they have been under the boot of religious dictatorship for 4.5 decades, maintain and have always maintained a very important, robust role in politics. They were at the forefront of the 1905 revolution. I didn't get a chance to tell that story. In 1953, they were at the forefront of the 53 revolution. In 1979, women were literally at the forefront of the revolution. They were in front of the marchers because they knew that the soldiers wouldn't shoot them. So they were human shields for everybody else. This time, however, I think that the voice of these young women is going to force change in Iran. Now, what is that change going to look like? Is it going to suddenly collapse and become a modern secular democracy? I mean, I hope so, but I don't think so. But I do believe that what these women have managed, and this is no small feat, in fact, it's huge. What they have managed is to excise the last little kernel of legitimacy that this government maintained. When you see old women dressed head to toe in chadors, the most constrictive, the most pious form of Islamic dress, standing shoulder to shoulder with an 18-year-old in shorts and a t-shirt, and both of them saying death to the dictator, it's over. It's over. And I think what we're seeing right now, and it's not surprising, is this government reacting the way a caged animal would react, with unfettered violence in the hope that that will be enough. But it won't be enough. Not this time. So we're a long ways from getting to anywhere that we hope to be. But I have never been more optimistic than I am now that at the very least, the horror that is this government will be consigned to the dustbin of history where it belongs.
Well, it's a good note to wrap things up on. Thank you all so much for coming. Please help me thank Reza Aslan for the session. Take care. Have a great day.